Well, Carol, thank you so much. One thing, though, she didn't mention, it was exciting to see Martha last night, wasn't it? I love entrepreneurs, and I've got this kind of sandy blonde hair and glasses. And so what a lot of folks don't know is I'm actually the secret love child of both Bill Gates and Martha Stewart. And I think you're going to be able to see it right there. So we all have our secrets, don't we, Keith? That's mine. Here's why we're here to talk about it. It's interesting statistic, 11,000 startups every hour in the world. So we're not hurting for new companies. The real challenge is, how do we get these ones to scale up? And I think it's not really an issue of industry. We make a lot of fun of how the automobile would displace the horse, yet I find it interesting, the equine industry is alive and well at over 300 billion around the planet. We just kind of transferred from transportation to entertainment. It's a little bit like the movie theaters. We're supposed to go out of business with Netflix. And so I don't think it's an industry problem that any of you have in here. It's always a leadership problem. And so that's really what we want to talk about here for a few minutes. There is the actual value. I love this photo, by the way. I think that's how man and machine end up ultimately working together as well. And it was interesting. I'm going to come back to Scott. Scott was one of our early clients. He's the new unicorn down in Australia. He and his partner took Atlassian public for $4.2 billion. They still held 70% of the company when they went public. They didn't give it all away as a tech firm. And I just checked last night here, 24 months later, they're at 15 billion in market cap. So they've pretty much done a 4X. And what they were clear when they were going through our tools is that's ultimately what it takes, is both discipline and focus, which is part of what I want to talk about here. What also I think is interesting, not only did Scott and his partner get stinking filthy rich, but they really had an opportunity to make an impact on today about 2,300 employees. They've consistently been named one of the very best places to work in Australia. And now that they've got a significant workforce here in the United States, they've been in the top 5 list consistently here as well. So I think what's neat is we can do well financially, and we can also do well by our employees along the way. Here's the latest unicorn. They're in the UK, Splash Damage, and our coach was walking up to Paul Wedgwood's car, and he saw there in the back a copy of my book. And so if you take nothing else from the presentation, I want you to equate scaling up equals Ferrari, all right? So that's where we're headed. And this is what I want to talk about. The topic that we decided were, what are the real barriers to scaling up? And there are really 3. First, it's right between our ears. Number 2, it's how do we handle this kind of a scalable infrastructure we need to put in place. The second biggest issue between companies 10 million to $1 billion, according to Tom Stewart at the Middle Market Center at Ohio State, is the digitization of our firms. And I want to kind of come back to that. And then number 3 is really marketing effectiveness. And I want to start there. I just want to be really practical. The fundamental barrier to scaling from a functional perspective is marketing, separate from sales. And a really quick question. How many of you have what you feel is a robust marketing department separate from sales? I do want to see a show of hands. Good. And it also involves something very practical, which is a 1-hour marketing meeting separate from sales. Now, what are we going to be working on during that? Well, I really have been a fan of Ogilvy's kind of pivot away from what are the 4 Ps of marketing: product, price, place, and promotion. And look, my view is marketing strategy equals strategy. And I don't think it was by accident. The late Steve Jobs, the only function Steve headed up was the marketing function. Tim Cook handled everything else. And he ran a 3-hour marketing meeting every Wednesday afternoon. Now, instead of these, 4 Ps, what Ogilvy's done is updated them to these 4 Es. And we saw, for instance, one of the things that Steve obsessed on was it wasn't just the product or service, but it was the entire experience. Look, they obsessed even about the box being a great experience for the customer. We've got a client, Dwight Cooper, that really obsessed about making sure that the invoice was a great experience for the payables clerk, so the 150 hospitals that were holding his cash hostage would take that invoice from the bottom of the pile and put it to the top of the pile. And that represented about $2 million in just additional cash flow because he made every touch point within his company a great experience. But What I want to do is I want to focus on one area that I feel we are absolutely ignoring as leaders, and that is the area of price. It's interesting, between World War II and 2007, the Great Recession, there was absolutely more demand than there was supply. And so I don't want to take anything away from your companies, but if you could just show up and deliver, you got the business. And we all spent time running around the planet in managing our supply chain. Could we just do it better, faster, cheaper? The pivot occurred in 2007, mainly because of the internet and what's happened with the middle class exploding around the planet. We now, for the first time in 50 years, have more supply than demand in every single industry. Think about it. The U.S. is now a net exporter of energy. And as a result, we as leaders have got to make the most significant pivot we've ever had to make in business, and that is from spending 80% of our week on the supply side of our business, our head into, if you would, the cost side. And now we need to be spending 80% of it on the price side. And real quick show of hands, how many of you have actually taken a course, read a book on strategic pricing? Good, because that's where the future is. Just think about Amazon. We've got the second wealthiest individual on the planet, Jeff Bezos, next to President Putin. And that's a joke, but not really. And how often, first, let's start here. How often does price change on Amazon? All the time. Yet the retailers competing with them are setting a price with a sticker, and the only time they make that change is when they want to try to give it away. There was a head of one of the major airlines. Look, that industry has been absolutely devastated from a profit perspective for decades. It's had a record 4 years. And as one of the heads of a CEO of one of the major companies said, look, if I've got 1,500 people between two routes, and I've only had 1,200 different prices, we've screwed up 300 times. This executive program, which I'll be teaching in tomorrow up at MIT, we had the reunion class last year, and one of the CEOs came in as business to business. He says, look, we have this piece of software that absolutely solves this major problem for a large company. We charge 30 grand for it, and we can't sell one of them. So he said, I went out and talked to the customers. And I said, look, you guys have this major problem. They go, yeah, we have this elegant solution. It looks like that. Why aren't you buying it? And they said, because it's only $30,000. There's no way that we trust that you're going to be here to support it for something that's this mission critical. When we've got 10x that budgeted. So what did he do very simply? 10x the price. And now he can hardly support as fast as he's selling this solution. Why are we such idiots when it comes to pricing? Why is it? Because we're selling to people. And there was this guy, Richard Thaler, who just won a Nobel Prize of all things in economics for discovering that human beings are not rational. So the father of influence, Robert Cialdini, just looked at a really fun experiment. Let's take a restaurant. They got a list of wines. They typically go from low price to high price. And all they did was switch the order of the wines from highest to low. Didn't change the price, didn't change the wine, and they generated 26% more revenue. Then they anchored it with a really, really expensive bottle of wine, and they drove up revenue 250%. It's not rational, and that's why we mess it up. So I just want to recommend a quick book. This is The Guru. He's a German. His consultancy is the largest in the world in the pricing space. And he finally wrote a book called Confessions of the Pricing Man. What I want you to do is I want you to go in there and read about the London Olympic case study. What's interesting, Rio lost $2 billion plus. London, 4 years earlier, generated more revenue than the previous 3 Olympics combined. And a big part of it was their unique pricing strategy. What I want you to realize is if you want to be different, but you're pricing the same as everyone else, you're not different. And so upping our game in this particular space as a component of marketing, I think is one of the most important decisions you in this room need to become a part of and spending a lot more time on. Number 2, scalable infrastructure. This is what crushes you, complexity. As you arithmetically add human beings, you geometrically increase the complexity. One of the things that we know is that the average size of an effective team is about 4.6. It's 5. There's a reason why our special forces teams are limited to 4 to 5 troops, not 8 or 9. It's one of the things that we also understand in nature through this program that I co-chair in Panama called Geoversity. And so here's the second significant pivot we're needing to make. Form and function mirror each other. See, last century we did back work, we did muscle work. And so it made sense that we built organizational structures that mirrored our skeletal system upon which we put our muscles. It's fun. I think we've got some alternative organizational structures. If any of you guys recognize some of these challenges with human beings, the secret resentment, well, some of this isn't quite appropriate. I love this one, chief idea killer, director of analysis paralysis. Look, manager of new growth ideas, that's absolutely vacant over there. We've even seen that it's always been personality driven, one of my favorite charts from Silicon Valley. But the reality is this, we have moved from our backs to our brains. And if our organizational structure doesn't mirror that, that's what's going to get you stuck, scaling in the 21st century. And so this is how it starts. You guys remember the early days, right? It was a team of you in a room, and then all of a sudden sales wanted their own office, and accounting needed quiet, and then you needed to open up space so you're close to customers, and then you began to organize around product groups and other things, and you saw Martha talk about it last night and some of the other changes, and that, interestingly enough, is the organizational chart of the 21st century. And what does it mirror? It mirrors our brain. So what we've got to do is we've got to pivot from a skeletal-like traditional structure to one that is much more agile. Now, is this just theory? So I want to recommend a couple of resources. This is a Belgian. This book, Reinventing Organizations, I think is the most important book written this century so far. Skip the forward. It's absolutely terrible. Part 1 will bore you to tears. But Part 2, I want you to go there and read it first. And you're going to read about companies like Spotify, that have organized around teams as opposed to traditional structure. And I want you to read about this healthcare organization named Butzark that's now come to the United States. Started 10 years ago. They have 14,000 nurses today and growing. They have some of the highest patient satisfaction, nurse satisfaction, and the entire organization of 14,000 nurses has 15 people at HQ, at headquarters, no middle management whatsoever, and just 18 coaches that kind of travel around to make sure that these teams of nurses, structured like that, are able to do their job. Just report it out. This Chinese, you can't do this in the East. This is one of the largest Chinese white good manufacturers in the world. They just made a significant decision with their 74,000 employees. They just eliminated all 10,000 middle managers. Nobody wants managed in the 21st century anyway, but they do need coached. And what they've done is they've organized those 74,000 employees into 4,000 teams, micro-enterprisers moving forward. By the way, what does that middle layer cost you? About 30% of your revenue. And this is where you've got a real opportunity to gain margin out in the marketplace. And so one of the guys that I invited here, Ron, I think you asked a question. You want to stand up, Ron Lovett. Ron just came out with an outstanding book. Most CEOs that write books, honestly, they're really not that good. And so Ron's been begging me to read it. And so over holiday last weekend in Barcelona, I took a look at it. And Ron did just this. He built out of Canada a private security firm of 1,500 employees, became one of the best in the industry for the movie industry and all of those. And Ron, you got rid of all the middle managers. You were able then to take that compensation and up it for the folks at the front line. And many of the other kind of things that we're talking about in terms of a modern organization, he was able to put into place. And so I would encourage you, if there's only one book you can read coming out of my particular presentation, it's grab Ron's new book, Outrageous Empowerment. Again, stand up, Ron, make sure they catch you at break. And he sold the thing in an industry that sells for 3 to 5 times earnings for 24 times earnings. Because of the, give him a hand, because of the kind of culture that he was actually able to build. One of the other things he did is he outlawed, as I had suggested in my Trends article a year ago, it's time to literally get rid of the word manager, and he pivoted those folks into coaches within the organization. And so that's the model, I think, for all of us in this particular room. And it was the same thing that Stanley McChrystal had to do in order to get us turned around in the Iraqi war, is get rid of the middle and empower the frontline teams of 6,000 in order to be able to get on top of an enemy that was driven today by really no centralized leadership and social media, which is precisely who every one of us is competing against here in the 21st century. That's why I come back to it last thing. Why is Scott's stock gone from $4.2 billion to $15 billion in about 30 months? Because they build the technology that allows us to create the corporate wiki. Look, the reality is if any of us get sick, we go to Dr. Google first. And what they did at Bootsarg is create Dr. Google across their 14,000 nurses so that 24/7, if I've got a particular question, phlebotomy question, I can go to that internal Wikipedia, the collective intelligence of everybody in that organization, and get the answer in nanoseconds, not worry about finding an expert someplace who might be busy this weekend. And so it's a technological change that must occur with this organizational change. And Google has been doing a lot of their research around how to make this effective. Last is leadership development, as we wrap up here with 3 minutes. In my second book, I featured what I thought was one of the greatest business decisions, one that Bill Gates made. And that was to institute what he called his Think Week. I want you to ponder that this is a technology company, 42 years old, that is still one of the top 5 market cap companies on the planet, up against the young'uns, the Amazons, the Googles, and the Facebooks. And the key is that they have focused on one thing. How do we as leaders remain relevant, and how do we keep our companies relevant? And so one of the things Bill did, because he had the same pile I've just piled on it, he had his tower of guilt, is he would take a week twice a year, and for 18 hours a day, 7 days straight, his record, 112 books, manuscripts, PhD theses, and white papers, because he knows that nothing creative can come out of this operating system you don't put in first. And so he piled it in, a habit that Mark Zuckerberg is now copying. Eric Schmidt, when we interviewed him on stage, as he was trying to help, as he was helping the Google boys scale, he said, what was the key? We asked him what was the key, and he said to shut his BlackBerry off every weekend and read a book or two. We hosted Mark Cuban. I've known Mark since his early days as an IT guy in Dallas, early involved in ACE and YEO. I didn't realize, though, till I read his book, that since age 20, his critical habit is 3 hours of reading every day. And all he's looking for is one idea to help one of the 150-plus companies he's invested in or own moving forward. Mark Zuckerberg obviously started the same habit as Bill Gates. Bill reads about 50 books a year. He publishes them every year. Mark's about half that, and he puts the list out as well. But I thought this was interesting. On the 50th anniversary, we were talking about Warren last night and this morning. On the 50th anniversary of Berkshire Hathaway, they asked his partner, Charlie Munger, all right, come on, be straight with us. How's Warren done it? How's he beat the market by a factor of 10 for 50 years? And Charlie didn't hesitate. He said it's Warren's first priority to reserve much time for quiet reading and thinking, even with this advanced age that he's in. It's about 500 pages a morning. And so our view is, if you want to 10x your companies, it's a fairly simple formula. You've got to 10x the knowledge. And you heard that from McKinsey and others about how we've really got to begin to develop our people. If you're not literally focused on 10xing the knowledge of everyone else in your organization, that's going to be the constraint moving up. And so I want to kind of finish. I had a really tough decision to make. My first book, Tom Peters, the guy who created the genre of business books that we read today, dear friend of mine, was kind enough to endorse my first book. Jim Collins wrote the forward for the second book, one of the other icons of business and a dear friend. So who was I going to put on the cover of my latest book? And I chose one of my early students. He went to Poland and opened up the very first Pizza Hut when the wall came down, the Iron Curtain came down. And let's speed forward today, the 25th anniversary of his company. This year, I just saw him at a Russia University a few weeks ago, still a major client of ours. 38,000 employees, over 1,600 restaurants, 16 countries. He's now the largest European owner of restaurants in the world, from Russia to China to Spain, where I just hung 8 years. And what's interesting, they just finished a 12-year study, and in terms of performance, his crushed number 2 by almost a factor of 2 across all the other restaurant owners across the European continent. And it was interesting, when we hosted Henry in front of his 1,000 restaurant plus managers at their anniversary, he said something very profound, I thought. We're more a training company than a restaurant company. And that's why we've done what we've done with this kind of frontline workforce, not the kind we're looking at the Googles, Facebooks, and elsewhere. And so I wrap with this final thought. You know, Steve and I had the privilege to host his first public speech when he was fired from Apple, and have obviously followed his career since, rest his soul. And it was interesting, in the wilderness years, he learned focus. You know, when he was at Pixar, he found the power of having just one thing, which was Toy Story. And so when he got back to Apple, he got him out of a whole bunch of other stuff and said, we're going to do the same thing, one hit every 2 years. So he did the iPod, then he did the iPhone, then he did the iPad. And look, there was no fooling Steve. He knew he was dying. And he had to choose his final 24-month project. What are you going to choose to focus on if you want to make sure that your baby not only survives, but thrives when you're gone? And what was that final project that he spent his time on? But Apple University. And he really understood that it's not just Tim Cook that's going to make sure that the company moves forward, now the largest market cap company on the planet by over a factor of 3 since he passed away. But it was going to require everyone, all 250,000 plus employees, to be able to do that. And so there it is, the 3 barriers. First, thank you for being here. This is why this is put on, and so we can continue to fill you up between your ears and give you that idea that you might be able to use today or 10 years from now. Number 2, it's a revolution is upon us. It requires technology to drive these new organizational structures. And number 3, get serious about marketing, particularly price. There's the book. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share.